sometimes in these situations you say, what an act to follow. This is really a good act to follow in the sense of what Pierre and Paul have been talking about, and there are going to be lots of echoes in my presentation, and so I'm going to invite you to try and detect those echoes. I'm looking forward to the discussion that's going to follow, and so I hope you will too. There it is. The Cambridge edition of Joseph Conrad's Nostromo was published in July 2023. And like Paul's, this is a bit of a serial paper in that I presented at last year's conference, and that preceded the publication of this volume that's pictured here before you. The Cambridge edition of Nostromo, the familiar black dust jacket and board surrounding 818 pages, and each printed and bound copy weighing 1.2 kilograms of book logic. I make this observation to think through the material nature of this edition and towards the digital forms that radiate from it when the processes of literary production are taken into account. Thinking through the material and towards the digital inevitably prompts questions about the capacity of print-based scholarly editions to capture the life of a literary work, and the potential of digital scholarly editions or archives to enable readers or users to experience the work in all of its complexities. Such questions are not new and have been posed before in relation to the challenges of editing the works of Joseph Conrad. It's almost 30 years since Sid Reed, then general editor of the Cambridge edition of the works of Joseph Conrad, considered the potential of electronic or digital scholarly editions in his essay, Conrad in Print and on Disc. This paper will reflect on the aspirations and caution in Reed's essay, while also considering the broader aims of the Cambridge edition. Using the Cambridge edition of Nostromo as a case study, the paper will interrogate the tensions between the reality of print and the digital aspirations of Conrad scholars then and now to argue that both forms are necessary for Conrad studies to proceed in the 21st century. There's the echoes going for you. When Conrad began, and this is a bit of a recap for anybody who wasn't at the session last year, but it weighs more closely on the distribution of the documents that came out of Conrad's work. When Conrad began writing Nostromo late in 1902, his working methods and his support structures were well established. Residing at Pent Farm since 1898, this Kentish location remained his primary place of production for almost a decade. Managed by literary agent James Pinker since late 1900, he primarily engaged with the world of publishing through Pinker's office, and he relied on Pinker to arrange for the typing of his handwritten manuscripts, to provide everyday secretarial duties, and deliver financial support through advances that eventually ballooned into the significant debt that was only cancelled after the commercial successes of his later career. The processes of literary production initiated at Conrad's writing desk at Pent Farm were inexorably tied to this association with Pinker in the competitive world of fiction, to which he contributed narratives that consolidated his reputation as one of the most innovative writers of his time. Like most of his longer works, Nostromo had commenced as a serialization in January 1904, well before Conrad had finished the novel for book publication in October of that same year. The process of writing out sections of the novel longhand before revising typed copy and continuing with longhand established the seriatim method of composition that characterized his working methods for the rest of his career. A period of dictation to a typist in 1904 added another method of composition to Conrad's repertoire, but revision on this and subsequent clean copy typescripts ensured that the record of Conrad's composition and revision covers a complex network of documents, including galley and page proofs of the magazine and book publications that subsequently represented the various published versions of Nostromo. The result of this productivity is witnessed in a collection of extant documents now located in several institutions or in private hands across the world. Small and large sections of the manuscript, first page here, are located at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia at the Beinecke, and also at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. On these sheets of manuscript, we see the first signs of Conrad's work coming into being and then evolving as the author works to construct the narrative that emerges and grows in his imagination as his words and sentences are scratched onto the page in ink. Conrad's flowing hand on some pages indicates periods of unfettered creation, while words and sentences that are crossed out indicate the author's struggle for les mots justes, as he used to call it, false starts that required testing and retesting until the author was temporarily satisfied and could move on to the next blank sheet of manuscript. It's quite a clean copy of manuscript before us. A bit to take in here, the typescript leaves, an example that you see on the left, associated with the production of Nostromo, are extant in 9 separate clutches, most at the Bibliography University, but another large section is located at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, across the other side of the American continent. The Huntington typescript and a portion of Bibliography typescript was typed by Lillian Hallows from Conrad's dictation, allowing it to be positioned roughly between the 2 large batches of manuscript held at the Rosenbach in terms of chronology. The remainder is a lightly revised clean copy typescript that printers of TP's Weekly, that you see top middle there, used as setting copy. The vast majority of extant typescript presents only the last chapters of Part 2 and the first 8 chapters of Part 3. Except for a fragment of the opening chapter, no typescript exists for the majority of the first 2 parts and the final 3 chapters of the novel. In the case of Nostromo, Lillian Hallows was Conrad's amanuensis, leaving her own mark on the process of composition and the appearance of extant typescripts. Like the manuscript, the extant typescript does not present a complete version of Nostromo. Nevertheless, marks left on the clean copy typescript provide evidence of the direct relationship with the setting of the serial version in TP's Weekly. Preparing a text for book publication would remain Conrad's primary concern, but procedures of serialization would impact the way this text was assembled. With other serials awaiting publication, the magazine editors were aiming to bring the serial to a close as soon as possible in order to accommodate new work. This is seen in a polite letter from the editor W. Whitten on 15th of August. Forgive me for bothering you again, but can you give us an idea of how much matter you will be sending in to complete Nostromo? You will easily understand that we are placed in a position of some difficulty by the unexpectedly long continuance of your excellent story. The pressure from TP's Weekly to produce copy forced Conrad's hand, and this pressure was the primary reason for the truncated ending that appears in the serial. After dictating to Miss Hallows since March 1904, Conrad had returned to writing longhand in July, and needing to provide copy a month in advance, would have been working to complete the 9th chapter of Part 3 when Whitten's letter arrived. In just over 2 weeks, under significant pressure, Conrad wrote enough material to fill the final 4 installments, a much shorter version than which appeared in book form. With Conrad's expanded ending witnessed on the pages of a series of proofs now lost to scholarship, Harper's published Nostromo in London on the 14th of October, 1904, top right there, printing 3,000 copies, 1,000 of which were set aside for George Bell's colonial edition. On the other side of the Atlantic, I don't have a copy there, Harper's published Nostromo on the 23rd of November, printing 3,000 copies in the United States as well. A second English edition appeared in 1918, there it is in the middle, published by Dent, and the novel was included in the collected editions published in 1920-21 by Doubleday and Heinemann. There's just one of those, that's the Heinemann collection there, and just all of the subsequent editions that many of which descend from those editions. So if we think about that, I'm just going to click back to that 1918 edition, just to clarify where that one sits. After publishing The Shadowline in March 1917, the London publisher J.M. Dent followed up Conrad's latest work with several volumes from Conrad's backlist, releasing Lord Jim and Youth and Other Stories in quick succession. Conrad barely touched these volumes, leaving the publisher to set from early editions and make corrections. But for Nostromo, he saw this latest publishing venture as an opportunity. Setting from the Harper's first English edition, Dent's delivered page proof to Conrad in September 1917. responding to the proofs with enthusiasm, quoting him, "Personally, I'm been glad to see them. I'm attending to the proofs and I rather like it. Jolly good stuff." 15 years after his first publication in book form, Conrad took the opportunity to execute revisions, reporting to Hugh R. Dent what he had done and why. The first edition was most unsatisfactory. You'll find several passages deleted bodily. Pray have all that carried out, even if it costs some trouble, for they really are superfluous. And this edition of Nostromo, that 1918 one, the Cinderella of all my books, may even be renewed as a new book. Echoing Conrad, I might say the same thing about this most recent edition of Nostromo. Its newness is seen in the reading text, which continues the long-lived aims of the Cambridge edition, to quoting the general editors, to present as closely as possible the text Conrad expected to be published in 1904, supported by an apparatus of emendation and historical variation, along with textual and explanatory notes, glossaries, and other notes. As my esteemed co-presenter, and I'm going to have Pierre Walker here as well, as the discussions that we're thinking about in the terms of the labor that goes behind this sort of work. The book logic of such an edition, and that book logic is quoting one Paul Leggett as well, of such an edition in a single whole, is a single whole, and yet silently the editorial responsibilities are both editorial and archival. More echoes there. A longer version of this paper will discuss the tension between the editorial and archival impulses that influence the choice of formats used to represent or present the life of the work to readers. But for the sake of brevity today, I'm going to quote Paul again, who described the satisfaction of archival impulses in the 1990s and later in the promise of electronic editions, quoting him here. In the middle of the 1990s, Paul wrote, or quoted, said, "We had naturalized the book form, yes, but we were also foremost among humanities scholars in fretting under its constraints. We envisaged a better future." And you're seeing that story across the two papers so far. For more than a decade, I have fretted over these constraints as I tried to cram as much of the work into the Cambridge edition as I could, while keeping an eye out for software developments that might expand the scope of representation to include images and transcriptions and other affordances, just as Pierre and Paul have been talking about so far. I established the text with the help of a development version of the software that lies behind Paul's Charles Harper Critical Archive, the Ecdosis that you've just seen, supplemented by Juxta software about the time my development version crashed. A teasing experience that shined the light on the potential of electronic editions, a light snuffed out by circumstance and the conditions that surround the editing of Conrad in either print or electronic formats. The attraction of electronic media is not new to Conrad's scholarship. A series of computer-assisted concordances of Conrad's works were produced in the 1970s. Heart of Darkness, for instance, appeared in 1973. Todd Bender in 1976 could have been writing in the 1990s or 2000s. In the library, he wrote then, of the future, the works of authors will be conceived in a way radically different from the conception which underlies our current practices. Ambiguities of the textual transmission will be preserved and investigated as a source of interest and not resolved or hidden in editorial selection. This more sophisticated view of the work, Bender continued, is possible only when the work is conceived free from the limited limitations of printed paper as the vehicle for its representation. Such plans remained prominent within the Cambridge edition throughout the early decades of the project, circulating with a position paper for the Cambridge digital edition of Joseph Conrad circulating in the 1990s, and then former Editor-General Sid Reed's publishing Conrad in print and on disc in 1995. Position that in your chronology of development in technology. But with a widely distributed collection of materials, kind of like I've just described, under various controlling bodies, and the expense of taking further steps, John Stape declared in 2015, quote, "The future of a digital Conrad remains uncertain, perhaps even bleak." With all energies devoted to the next volumes in the series, little time has been devoted to the revival of a digital edition of Joseph Conrad, book logic prevails. With John Stape's bleak account of the prospects for a digital edition in 2015, it's worth spending a bit more time with Sid Reed's 1995 account. Sid Reed's essay follows the scenario of an Oxford-trained scholar located in South America wanting to pursue research on Conrad that relies on the evidence found only on original documents held in American and British research libraries. Access to the original documents is necessitated by the instability of Conradian texts and the uncertainty surrounding the authority of any single document to serve critical scrutiny. Should the scholar of this anecdote, Sid Reed wrote, or even the general reader have to put up with this situation? While a print-based critical edition produces a much more reliable text than the apparatus, quoting the Cambridge edition again, is designed primarily to document the editing, certain kinds of information a scholar wants are not always accessible as could be hoped. The scholar could take the time to write away for photocopies or wait for facsimile editions of the manuscripts and typescripts, but in 1995, a better solution would appear to be a digital edition. Reed envisions an edition that has the capacity for audio-visual presentations to accompany editorial commentary that radiates from a home text. Continuing in his essay, variants in wording and other texts should be linked to the home text, presumably through hypertext software. Accurate transcriptions of the texts of Conrad's lifetime should be accessible in this way and also capable of being searched and manipulated on their own. Letters for the period of composition and publication of each title should be accessible in a similar manner, Reed continued. Reed's other requirements for a digital edition include images of all pages of manuscripts, typescripts, and marked proofs, transcribed and encoded to a basic level in TEI, SGML, and linked to the home text, along with study aids like maps and recordings of music and other sounds that Conrad's audience could have recognized. In 1995, Reed could only look to the promise of the net, not the reality, due to its infancy, cost, sustainability, and accessibility. And so it's interesting to hear Pierre echo Sid Reed in some ways there. Reed imagines that, quote, computer files mounted on a machine at an editorial center should in theory be accessible to the world over telephone lines, through the internet and similar services. But in 1995, he settled for the more stable CD-ROM, accessible through many home computers as the most practicable mode of delivery for a digital edition. All right, I see I've got 3 minutes, David. I'm ready for the hook, but I'll just move through a few paragraphs that I've got here. At this time, it's interesting to see the examples that have presented themselves as models for such an edition. The very few. Looking at Patrick Sahl's catalogue of digital scholarly editions for projects devoted to novelists, there's a relatively short list. Jane Austen's fictional manuscript, Samuel Beckett digital manuscript project, the Willa Cather archive, James Joyce's digital archive, the Melville Electronic Library, and I'll include in there the Shelley Godwin archive with Frankenstein, the Digital Thoreau, the Mark Twain project, and Wolf Online. All of these were likely expensive. As Peter Schillingsberg said in 2013, considering all of the desirables in almost any project of importance, he declared, we want it quickly, cheaply, and of high quality. In scholarly editing, whether digital or not, whether done by an individual or a crowd, one can still have only two of those at a time. If it is cheap and fast, it will be of low quality. If it is of high quality, it will be either slow and cheap or fast and expensive. In the digital future for Conradian, if the digital future for Conradians remains uncertain or bleak, some glimmers of hope have emerged in the digitization plans of the institutions that hold much of the unpublished manuscripts and typescripts produced during Conrad's composition and revision. Yale's Beinecke Library in particular is leading the way with such digitization initiatives. For instance, researchers can read the manuscripts of a number of Conrad's short stories, but also longer works, such as the manuscript of Heart of Darkness, Chance in manuscript and typescript, and the combined manuscript and typescript of The Shadow Line. a good model for Nostromo. Digitization for Conrad first has also made images, not transcriptions, of most of Conrad's serialized works available for viewing. But within the closed digital archives of the long-lived Cambridge Edition project, I use the word siloing here, echoing Paul. There are files and files of transcriptions that have supported the digital collation in the project. So close and yet so far. This takes my mind back to another dreamer, Peter Robinson, whose vision of distributed editions would connect digital resources at multiple institutions with researchers from across the world. These fluid and cooperative editions will be distributed. Every reader may have a different text, and for any screen, the text may come from many different places. A manuscript transcription from one site, a layer of commentary from one scholar, textual notes and emendations from another, all on different servers around the globe. In a sentence, these will be fluid, cooperative, and distributed editions, the work of many, the property of all. Potentially connected via the standards of the resource description framework developed for the semantic web, a distributed edition might be achieved with strong personal institutional agreements, along with ongoing institutional support and persistent management of resources within such a framework. But, as Robinson conceded in 2003, none of this will be easy, and no scholarly edition like it yet exists. 20 years later, despite ongoing work on semantic web technologies in scholarly editing, I think I can safely say that this statement still holds true. And while that provides a glimmer of hope in regards to Conrad's digital future, and a new phase of editorial work will have to begin. While the 1.2 kilogram edition of Nostromo might not be directly involved in such developments, it, along with other volumes produced over a period of more than 30 years, provides and will provide a scholarly reference point from which to begin. Thank you.